Hello, everyone, and welcome to Intentional Conversations VodCast. Happy Friday to each of you. I just want to take a moment, and as people are entering into the room and they're getting settled, just to acknowledge that you could be anywhere right now, but you saw fit to join us for this community, and we don't take that for granted. We look forward to robust discussion today. And so I want to do something a little different in the spirit of the content that's going to be shared. And I know it's going to be a rich conversation, which is going to be deeply steeped in conversations around belonging. And that is to do a special welcome. So allow me just a moment to do this. We welcome participants of African, Asian, Arab, Middle Eastern, and European descent. Those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, Black, White, Indigenous, Native, biracial, and people of multiple races and ethnicities. We welcome participants from different faiths, religion, traditions, spiritual beliefs, private practices, and belonging to a tradition, agnostic, atheists, and seekers. We welcome those of you with disabilities, visible or invisible. We welcome those of you who identify as single, dating, partnered, married, separated, divorced, or widowed. We also welcome participants of all sexual orientation, preferences, and gender identities. And we welcome those of you who identify as parents, step-parents, foster parents, godparents, guardians, caretakers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, daughters, sons, nieces, nephews, cousins, grandmothers, grandfathers, granddaughters, grandsons, and our colleagues who have adopted or have been adopted. I hope each of you feel seen, valued, and heard and welcome because you belong here. I am Dr. Nika White, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so excited to bring an opportunity for this community to convene, just to have some really great conversations that helps us to grow in our individual journey of inclusive leadership. And I invite you all to use the chat today to create a sense of community. If some of us says something that resonates with you, place it into the chat, provide positive affirmations. Feel free to even share maybe your LinkedIn information so that we can stay connected even beyond the hour that we are convened here today. I want to take a moment and go through a couple slides as we normally do, just to kind of set the tone for today. So let's go to the next slide, please. I have my team that's backstage assisting, and we're always so grateful for them and their support. So we like to always give an opportunity for the audience to understand what's coming up next on Intentional Conversations VodCast. And next week, we are welcoming Julie Kratz. I'm so excited to have her as our guest co-host. And in that Intentional Conversations VodCast, myself as well as Lauren Bouquet, my colleague, we are going to be talking with Julie Kratz about the importance of allyship, and what a tremendous conversation that's going to be, and timely as we continue to find ourselves where we can make a difference in terms of how in which others are being treated, respected, and able to really just thrive at their best. And so we look forward to that. And then on Friday, April the 2nd, our first vodcast of April, Natasha Poritskova, who is serving in the producer role today for today's IC, is going to be back leading a conversation, and we welcome Amy Wagner. And in that IC, we're going to be taking a look at the importance of having a diverse and inclusive professional network. And so you don't want to miss that. Amy is really big in this space, and we look forward to welcoming her. Now, as we go to this next slide, it is a video that we want to share with you about our upcoming spring book club that you've heard a lot about. And so I'll let the video do the talking. Go ahead, Natasha.
Hello, I'm Dr. Nika White, founder and principal lead consultant of Nika White Consulting. And I am so excited to invite you to join us for our spring book club, the book club of 2021, where we are reading Better Allies, Everyday Actions to Create Inclusive and Engaging Workplaces by none other than Karen Catlin. This year, we're wanting everyone to delve deeper into their individual responsibility for serving as allies, and not just to people that are like them, but allies to those who are part of marginalized communities. This is going to be a great conversation that's going to span over 2 evenings, April the 22nd and April the 29th, where I will be joined with the author herself, Karen Catlin, as we talk about ways in which to increase our allyship and to do so in ways that will lead to great opportunities for others. I hope you will join us. It's only $35 for 2 entire sessions, and I can guarantee you it's going to be rich, it's going to be useful, and you're going to have a chance to interact live. And so join us. You can register right now, and we look forward to you spreading the word as well. Thank you.
We have been talking about this for a couple weeks now, but we're so excited to offer up our spring book club. And the book club we're using the book Better Allies by Karen Catlin. She's going to be joining us on 2 dates in April from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to dissect content that's in the book. And so I hope that you all will take an opportunity to consider this and to spread the word to those that are in your network. The cost to register is only $35, and that minimal fee includes access to both sessions. And whether or not you're able to join live, you will be able to receive the recorded of those sessions so that you can remain on top of all of the information that's being shared. So Karen Catlin is wonderful. She was one of our guest co-hosts a few weeks back. Many of you may recall that, but we look forward to having her join us and having you to consider this as a key opportunity. Okay, next slide, please. So we want to just take a moment before we jump into today's conversation to acknowledge how many of us are feeling called to action and really saddened by the hate that has been shown towards our Asian American Pacific Islander brothers and sisters. And so we want to make sure that we provide some resources to each of you as you're feeling called to action. And I know you can't probably make out all of these links here, but we're going to place a link to this PDF into the chat, and all of those links are live. And it just gives you an opportunity to identify ways in which you can get involved in helping to fight the hate crimes that are taking place right now against AAIP community. Okay, now it does me great pleasure to introduce our 2 individuals that are sharing this space with me today as we engage in really in-depth conversations. I first want to introduce my co-host, Lauren Decay, my colleague. She's a DEI manager with NWC. Her background is in real estate finance, accounting, and after soul searching, she discovered her passions lie within diversity, equity, and inclusion, and lucky for us that she did. She obtained her certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University in August of 2020. And is excited to put her new knowledge to use. Lauren has a unique perspective around DEI, as she has firsthand experiences with lack of inclusion and psychological safety in work environments. Before NWC, Lauren worked as an asset manager for a real estate developer called North American Properties. There, she spearheaded the rebrand of an outdated retail asset and the sales strategy for various mixed-use multifamily assets and office buildings. Lauren has vast experience in process improvement, change management, and executing action-based solutions. She hosts a podcast called Leading an Effective DEI Employee Resource Group, and she's also co-founded a real estate network for underrepresented minorities called We Up. She spends a lot of time volunteering with her local animal shelter and is a pit bull type dog advocate. So I wanted to do that because this is Lauren's first time serving as a guest co-host with me, although she's been with the firm now for about, 3 or 4 months. But now I want to also give an official introduction of Rhodes Perry, who is also our guest co-host for today. So Rhodes Perry, he uses he, him, his pronouns. He is an award-winning social entrepreneur, best-selling author, and sought-after keynote speaker. Nationally recognized as an LGBTQ plus thought leader, he has 20 years of leadership experience, having worked at the White House, the Department of Justice, and PFLAG National. You'll have to correct me if I'm saying it incorrectly, Rose, in just a second. Media outlets like Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, and the Associated Press have all featured his powerful work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion influencer. He serves as the CEO of RP Consulting, a global leadership and management consulting firm, helping visionaries and change makers build belonging at work. He earned a BA from the University of Notre Dame and an MPA from New York University. He also serves on the National LGBTQ+ Chamber of Commerce's Transgender Inclusion Task Force. please, everyone, in your own special way through the chat, help me to welcome our very special guest today, Rhodes Perry. And let me just say, my team, we're a little bit starstruck, and we've told him this a couple of times because we follow his work, and it always does our hearts just great joy when people that are in our network accept our invitation to come and share with this community. And so let's show Rhodes some love in our own special way. We appreciate you. We do. And we're just so glad you're here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the warm welcome. It's truly a feeling of belonging. So thank you. Thanks. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
No, well, I did that very specifically because of the topic that we're addressing today and what you stand for. I think that we have to be intentional about creating spaces that causes people to feel a sense of belonging. And so it requires that level of intentionality. And that was my hope. And so hopefully everyone feels like you belong here because you do. But, you know, one of the things that we always do, Rhodes, is as we start the conversation, we give the formal introduction to make sure people know all the accolades and the credentials of those who are joining with us. But then we like to take a step back and let our guest co-hosts to just share with us in their own way their story, their DEI story. Help us to know who you are beyond being able to read your bio.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And thank you for that opportunity. A few things about me, identity-wise. I'm a white, transgender, able-bodied person. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Florida. I lived most of my life, my adult life, in Washington, D.C., in New York City. I'm now living on the West Coast. And, you know, it's interesting when I think about how I arrived in doing this work. And it's been a 20-year journey, a history for me, in that in the early days and some of my first few professional jobs, so much of my role was doing the job I was hired to do and also trying to build trust, to build safety with my colleagues, to try to help organizations be a little bit more gender inclusive. So that was at the beginning of when I was coming out as being trans, and trying to get my colleagues to use the name that I use and the right pronouns, and lots of good intentions, lots of learning moments, and that really shaped my I guess my purpose. Like it started to become more clear that, you know, this was bringing me joy to actually help organizations do better, to be more inclusive. And I felt like there was a place for me in this broader profession of diversity, equity, and inclusion to add to trying to do better, to try to build organizations that work for all of us. And so that's a little bit about how I entered. And I guess like some of the approaches that I take in the work that I do is shaped by, you know, my training and doing organizational development, but also some of the work like working at PFLAG National, coming from a more social justice background of trying to advocate and trying to stand up for communities that are having a harder time just getting a job, let alone building a career. And so that's a motivator, and I love what I do, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more with you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Rhodes. So can you share a little bit about the Belonging at Work community? I want to share with everyone a fun fact. When I was trying to just get into the field and I wanted to learn as much as possible, one of the first summits I attended was the Belonging at Work Summit. And there was amazing speakers, and I took so many notes. I still have the notebook full of notes of different things, thought leadership ideas that I came across. And I was able to connect with Rhodes. A couple months later, he was able to fit me into his schedule, and I appreciated it so much. But it was such a great summit, and I would love for people just to learn about the summit, but also your book and your work and what you do.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank Lauren. It was so great to connect with you after going to the summit. The community was really born out of the summit. And so we've been hosting the summit. This is now the third year. It's starting in July, and it's a week-long summit. And what we wanted to make possible for people that are in the profession, in the field, and this started before COVID, was to create a virtual learning community where the live event was 100% free, and it was to invite in practitioners, but as well as people who are passionate about building more inclusive workplace cultures to learn and to have conversations that sometimes aren't facilitated at larger diversity, equity, and inclusion conferences. So being able to have those conversations that you're often having when you're getting coffee or you're at the water cooler at a conference, and to deliver that to as many people who would want to attend. And from that, the conversations were so rich, especially after last July, that people wanted more. And so we were already hosting community calls. So we opened that up to the group of people who went through, and there were 10,000 people who went through the summit last year, which was really great. And slowly, over the past year, it's been building and growing, where we're able to have conversations. And actually this Monday, we're having a conversation with Lily and Sai to talk about ways that workplaces can play a role in addressing and showing up and supporting our Asian American and Pacific Islander colleagues during these really difficult times. So the community the community really is for DEI leaders, right? So people that are looking for sharing ideas that are working well, and to have a community of peers to lift up successes, but also to work through some of the bigger challenges, and to feel like you're not the only and lonely or the few who are charged with really changing workplace culture and not feeling like you have support within an organization. So that's how it got started, and it's growing, and it's the highlight of my month when I get to have the opportunity to connect with our community, and I'm looking forward to how it develops over time. But I feel like it really is a space where we are building community care for each other in these really difficult times.
Absolutely. And I think community care is so very important, especially during these times. And there's I don't want to say an uptick, but actually more coverage on the Asian American hate crimes that are occurring. And I just want to ask your opinion about the perception of Asian Americans in the workplace, because there's actually an article that shows that although Asian Americans are model minorities and they hold very prestigious positions, they're the least likely group to get promoted. And when I think about allowing people to bring their full selves to work, there's some trauma, there's cultural differences, there's sometimes a wall up to receiving the inclusive efforts and gestures because people are trying to put in the front and look a certain way. So how do you bridge that gap between cultural differences and allowing people to bring their authentic self to work, but also not have a ceiling or a barrier to success?
Yeah. I think just in naming the statistic that you shared, I read that the other day as well, and it was surprising, right? But also bringing visibility to the barriers that exist for Asian American, Pacific Islander employees around being able to access stretch opportunities, leadership positions, being considered for that, and naming that this is not happening, and challenging organizations, challenging DEI teams to consider, how do we build this in? How do we prioritize when we're looking to diversify the boardroom or the C-suite? That this piece, this element of including Asian American, Pacific Islander employees is a part of that, and to start asking hard questions and then setting goals and holding ourselves accountable. I think that's a part of the work that we do, but making sure that it's speaking to communities that not just having access to those leadership positions, but not feeling a sense of safety on the job and getting really curious. And this is something that I often challenge leadership teams to think through is, one, do you feel a strong sense of belonging? And I allow them to kind of define that for themselves first before we talk about the components of it. And it's not surprising that many folks will at least verbalize, yeah, I feel like I belong on my team. And then the second piece is to challenge them, for those furthest removed from your position of power, do you also feel that there's a strong sense of belonging as an emotional outcome? Yeah. And there's just a question mark of like, wow, we don't know, or there's assumptions that are made, but there's, and so I think that then we get into the conversation around what it takes to belong, and looking at psychological safety and trust as these kind of building blocks to it. And exploring, and then kind of doing the work of examining, where does safety break down? If people don't even feel safe enough to show up at work, are you going to have that innovation that you want? Are you going to be able to take the risks that you need to have a high performing company? And then that's where we start to have some rich conversations. So I think that, just going back to kind of AAPI employees, it's starting to ask those tough questions and getting some awareness, and then starting to make some commitments to make change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that question, Lauren. So thanks so much, because you're putting us right in the center of unpacking psychological safety, which is a phrase that many of us have heard and we use in this space. But I'm sure there probably may be some audience members that aren't fully aware of what that means and why that's important. So I just want to give you a chance, Rhodes, to kind of deepen the elaboration on psychological safety and trust and the importance of that to this concept of a strong sense of belonging in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look to people like Amy Edmondson, and she's one of kind of the thought leaders around psychological safety. And she did this famous study about 10 years ago where she studied teams in hospital settings to find out if better performing teams made fewer mistakes. That was her hypothesis. So you're a good team, you're not going to make that many mistakes. And what she found is that better performing teams actually made more mistakes. And she was like, okay, what the heck is going on? And when she started to dive a little bit deeper, she found out that the better performing teams had this strong sense of team cohesion. And they had this sense where they could report mistakes, they could ask for help, they could provide constructive criticism. This was an environment where they could take interpersonal risks. And these were the components that started to shape her definition of psychological safety. And I think that's really important for those organizations, for leaders who really prize the sense of, we want to be an innovative company, a visionary company. If you don't have an environment where you can take risks, and where failure, calculated failure or whatever, fast failure, whatever you want to call it, where failure can't happen, you're not going to have the innovation, because oftentimes, for that next great idea, business product, even an industry breakthrough, it takes a number of failures before you can get there. And if you're on a team where you're worried about your job security, if you make one mistake, the innovation piece is not going to be there, and you're going to have a status quo company. And I think that's where a lot of business leaders are at right now, is how do we have relevant businesses for the future? And I think in the moment that we're in for the DEI field, this is such a critical component to prepare organizations for the future, to work for us, for employees, and to celebrate the differences that we bring into the organization. If we fear sharing something about who we are that's central to being able to show up fully in the workplace, if there's a fear that might also compromise our job security, that's also going to limit our ability to be innovative. So the psychological safety component is such a huge piece, and it's one of those terms that we use it a lot. It's almost like saying trauma informed. So it's a kind of a buzzword, but it's not. If we think about it as an environment to kind of take these interpersonal risks, and what does that actually mean? It kind of simplifies it a little bit. So I hope that's helpful.
No, I'm so glad that you unpacked that for us. And you're right. I think it's, something that we don't spend a whole lot of time unpacking. So it was really good to give that level of context. And there's actually a really great video where the person who actually coined the phrase psychological safety, is maybe a 2 or 3 minute video. I'm going to see if my team can kind of source that and place it into the chat, because I think it would be a great resource. But and on our organizations, I hear a lot of people talk about it as failing forward. We call it growing better, but we have to give people the freedom to be able to take those risks. And quite honestly, it's harder for people that are part of those marginalized communities within workplaces to even get to a place to where they're comfortable even considering the risk, let alone just take it. And so it's such an important part of the broader topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it brings me to actually this next point, which is around covering and masking, because what will happen is that if spaces aren't psychologically safe for people, then they will cover, they will diminish portions of their identity, and they will conform to mainstream way of thinking, and they will just mask, which means that we aren't getting the value of diversity because people aren't being authentic, and they aren't letting the uniqueness of who they are to show forth within that environment. And so I think we have a poll that I want to engage the audience in. It's really just to see on a scale of 1 to 5, who feels as though you're able to be your full self versus how many of you are challenged by finding yourself in spaces where you may cover or mask in some ways? And so if we could get that poll up, it'll be good just to see how this audience responds. But in the interim, I want to give Rhodes, you as well as Lauren, just an opportunity to react to the covering and the masking that occurs.
Well, I have another elaboration on psychological safety that I think in the spirit of belonging is important to bring up. The more I think about it, I think psychological safety in defining it for your specific organization and team, it's a two-way road, because if you're really bringing your true self to work, it's kind of like, okay, I need these things in order to succeed, and these things make me feel not willing to take risks. And then the person you report to or leader will say, okay, well, I can try to make these efforts, but just know that when I do this and this, it's not intended to affect you this way, or I will try to do this, but just knowing from my experiences, it may not be an easy journey. So I think it's very important that if you truly feel a sense of belonging, you can communicate things you need to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that environment for risk taking. I love what you added, Lauren, because it's also knowing that there's not a fear of repercussion if you are taking that risk, reporting the mistake, asking for help, offering constructive criticism or feedback, that will actually make the organization better. So it's really, really important to think about that. On the covering piece, as people are answering it, I'm just kind of looking over at the chat over here. I think something that I'd just like to add as like a personal story to help other folks locate where they are in this is when I worked at the White House, I had this. It was a great job. It was in the budget office, and it was a lot of responsibility when I was young, and yet I was emotionally exhausted, and I felt really disconnected from my team because it wasn't about the job. It was that I couldn't be myself. And so while my colleagues respected my name and my pronouns, even though they didn't know that I was trans, I felt like I couldn't share more about my gender history because it was in the early 2000s. I thought if I did share this, I would be seen as the office educator, and I didn't want it to take away from my ability to advance in the organization. And ultimately, it did cost me my job because I didn't feel included. I didn't feel a place of belonging. And at that time, there weren't job protections for gender identity in the White House. So, an example of how that would show up is like we'd be hanging out at the water cooler, and a colleague would innocently ask me, hey, Rhodes, what sports did you play in high school? And it's like one of those really simple questions that's not a bad question. Sometimes people, after I share this story, I'm like, they will say, I'm not supposed to ask about sports. It's not the question. It's just that it's about that feeling of safety and recognizing, if I shared, I played women's fast pitch softball for 15 years, that would be the record that's scratched. Like, why are you playing women's fast pitch softball? And then there would have to be this disclosure and a whole detailed conversation. So it's those are some of the pieces that we have to work at building a culture that's inclusive and start to ask questions about who feels included here and who doesn't. And oftentimes our culture is something that we inherit. Our organization as leaders, we inherit. This is the business that we run. This is the way that we behave. Okay, this is what I need to do to continue to go along, to get along, to advance in my own career. But it's not necessarily honoring, if we have them, DEI commitments in the organization. So really examining this piece of psychological safety. It's something that we can measure. It's something that we could look at in poll surveys. If we break things down by demographics to get a better understanding. Okay, this is a group of employees that feels a strong sense of safety. This is a group of employees that doesn't. We have this universal goal. We want everyone to feel a sense of belonging, yet we're gonna have to take some targeted interventions to center our efforts, our DEI efforts around those least likely to feel safe, right? Like that's kind of a frame that we could take. But it takes asking some hard questions and being okay with being uncomfortable because we're talking about safety, and safety should be the priority over our sense of being comfortable. Because if we're comfortable, chances are we're going to be in a status quo organization and we're going to get the same results we've always gotten, right? Which may not be great.
Absolutely.
No, that's great. I was looking at the chat, and we have the largest percentage of our audience are indicated 3, as on a scale of 1 to 5, how much they feel that they need to cover at the workplace. And so, where you sit in an organization determines what you see, determines your lens. And so it would be interesting to really take a deeper dive to understand, if we were to do the same poll across many different organizations, what levels, and are those individuals mostly a part of underrepresented, or I like to say underestimated populations? My guess would be yes, that's true. But yeah. So do we have any tips for individuals? I realize that part of getting comfortable with being able to be authentic and not have to cover or mask has a lot to do with the environment and the culture. But I also feel like there may be some things that individuals can do as well as they're navigating these spaces that may not already be at that level of a strong sense of belonging. So does anything come to mind, Rhodes and or Lauren, about what we can do as individuals who are challenged with, anxiety around showing up as our full selves and not having to cover and mask?
So I can so for me, I personally have dealt with that just because of past work trauma. Even coming to NWC, it's like led by a Black woman just like me. I'm still like, ooh, there's certain things where I feel uneasy about. And I think for me, just by nature, loving authenticity, I like just communicating that. And I have communicated that to you, Nika. And I think it provides you with a holistic understanding of who I am and different efforts you can make to help me feel more included. And I think it's also just digging deep within yourself and trying to really analyze people's intents, because even sometimes not creating a space of belonging isn't the intent. It's like people are just doing it because that's the way they would learn to do it. And just kind of taking a psychology approach of really trying to understand intentions, I think that eases anxiety, at least for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking, it's being able to have both like the role of mentors or sponsors and having someone that you really trust that may not be in your organization, but could be in your field, and to be able to talk this through. I know for myself, just around kind of when do I disclose around being trans, or how do I talk about being a part of the LGBTQ community? It's like, I feel like I'm implicitly out, yet it's a process where you have to kind of come out again and again and again in different contexts. And so having professional mentors who've navigated that for decades, right? Like is one thing that's helpful. And it may not always provide like the real-time solution I need in that moment, but knowing that there's someone I can lean on is helpful. As well as like if they exist, and I know not every organization has them, but for an employee resource group network or a business resource group, affinity group network, whatever the name might be, if they do exist and there's a group that aligns with some aspect of your own identity, that could also be a place of support, but also a way to engage and to connect with community, and to also serve as mentors yourself, depending where you're at in your career. I think that that's helpful. It's not necessarily, a panacea to kind of navigate, different moments that you have, but to be able to connect with colleagues who might be going through some similar struggles. And finding a space where you can be more of yourself at work is really, really key.
I love that. So, Rhodes, can you elaborate more on the necessity of trust in the workplace? I know personally, I always think about trust. It's kind of like everyone has a jar, and there's little efforts that you have to fill up a jar before you fully get trust from, or you can truly rely on trust from different people. So I'd love to hear how we can do that in the workplace.
Yeah. So trust building is like the other component of feeling that team cohesion. So it's being able to feel interconnected and to be able to work well with your colleagues. And I think, there's 3 components that I look at with trust building, which is one, kind of this concept of Sonder. And it's this idea that each random person that you pass is living a life as vivid and as complex as your own. So, their own ideas, beliefs, attitudes, fears, behaviors, etc. And that Sonder reminds us that that rich inner world is 100% invisible to us. So we're the star of our own show, and everyone else is kind of the supporting cast. And that's the same for you and for Nika, and for, so we all have our own movies that we're starring in, and we have to engage to build trust, to understand, to feel understood, that our movie is understood, right? Is to be able to engage in active listening and to have curiosity. So for me to understand your inner world, Lauren, I'm going to have to ask you a lot of questions that are questions that are questions that will invite you, if you'd like, to share more about who you are, and that's going to help me connect to your movie, to your story. And then once I know more about who you are, I'm going to practice the platinum rule, which I'm sure some folks here understand that, but it's abandoning the notion of the golden rule, where we treat others in a way in which we want to be treated in our own movie, and instead treat others in a way in which they want to be treated in their movie. And the only way that we can do that is by asking questions and really understanding our colleagues. And that helps build trust, because you're inviting in really meaningful conversations that, when a project is happening and you do have to take a risk, I know, because I know you, Lauren, that you're going to have my back, and vice versa, to kind of work on this project. And if we encounter a mistake, or we grow together through a failure, we're going to do it together, right? And so I think those are some of the components that helps me share how to build trust with other people. But I really do like the concept of Sonder. It's just a good reminder of like, right, I don't know what's going on for my colleague unless I start asking questions.
Yeah.
I think in this moment that we're in right now, that's really, really critical, because we're living in a pandemic, and it's really, really challenging for us in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that reminds me of, Nika, how we discussed the high quality connections. I don't know who coined the phrase, but basically they don't have to be formal conversations, but just conversations to really get to know your coworker. And it's like every time you have those deepish conversations, you build more trust and connection, which allows you to build more of a sense of belonging. So I think it's really great to connect with people like that.
Absolutely. Now, this is such rich conversation. So I see that a number of questions are coming through, and we're so grateful for those. We are curating them and pulling them into the backstage chat, and we will transition to those questions momentarily. But I want you, Rose, to talk more about this belonging community that you have established. Let's give us a little bit more understanding of what that is. I'm sure some people are thinking, how can I get involved? And so talk about that for us.
Yeah. So it's an online community, and we meet twice a month, and we usually have one guest speaker come in, and we talk about a topic that's trending, something that we're working in the field, and then we have interviews like this, but really kind of featuring the thought leadership of another DEI leader, and then allowing the community to share questions. And then after that initial meeting, we meet 2 weeks later, and we actually get to process. We get to kind of talk about what we learned, reflect on how that's showing up in our own work. Sometimes we do kind of a live coaching session where we have one or two DEI leaders share about either a success or a challenge that they're working through. And then we get to kind of share, we allow the broader group to kind of offer up if they've been there before, or kind of just to take notes furiously of like, oh, if this ever happens, now I have a better sense of how to respond. And the idea, again, like why it originated outside of the summit is that it kind of goes back to when I was leading this work in New York City. I was working for a child welfare organization, and we were trying to improve services for LGBT young people in foster care and juvenile justice settings. And the person that I was reporting to said, "I love what you're doing, Rhodes, and I have no idea how to support you." It was like one of those moments where I was like, "Oh my gosh, I have to build." I'm so excited that you all are doing how to grow your network in a couple of weeks, because that's what I had to do really quickly. Is that I'm not going to get the support inside of this organization. Yet there's so much responsibility on my shoulders to try to, it's a moment, it's an opportunity to build something better. So why not connect with other people? And I just kind of took that spirit in building this community. So I can share a link if folks are interested in checking more of it out. But the other cool thing about it is there's an online learning library. So with past talks or with webinars that we host every quarter, there's a lot of information that's available in there, including worksheets just to kind of reflect on the work that you're doing yourself, or if you're facilitating groups inside your organization, you can certainly use those worksheets just to kind of get some of these conversations going.
That is great. Yeah, equipping people with tools. So not just convening to talk and stand in solidarity with each other, but then also tools to be able to grow better, as we like to say at NWC. That's awesome. So I have one last question, and then I'm going to ask my colleague to shift and Lauren to present some of the questions that are coming from the audience. But as we talk about the broad subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not just about the people function in HR. It's so many other components to it as well. And you and I share passion for economic inclusion, ensuring that all business owners are able to be a part of competing effectively in the marketplace, growing and thriving. And that includes women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, ethnic minority-owned businesses, business owners that are part of the LGBTQ plus community. And what I find is that while we talk often about women's certifications and ethnic minority certifications, I don't think that people are quite as aware that there's also certifications for business owners that are part of the LGBTQ community. And you have been somewhat involved in that in multiple capacities. And so let's kind of speak to that a little bit, just so this audience is fully aware that that is a certification and that that's a population of people that certainly also needs to be in the consideration set and thought about. And let's just amplify that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce certifies businesses that are owned by LGBTQ people, ownership 51% or more. And I actually have a podcast called The Out Entrepreneur, where I've interviewed about 200 of these LGBTQ business leaders. And we talk about the reasons why certification is really important. There's a number of studies that are out there, and the Williams Institute is a really great think tank based out of UCLA that looks at the economic barriers for LGBTQ people. And there's a report that they put out, I think about 6 years ago, but it talks about the myth of LGBTQ affluence, and it really breaks down where the barriers are economically, by and large, for LGBTQ populations. And when you look at LGBTQ folks of color, transgender people broadly, those economic barriers get more challenging. So when you look at the poverty rate or the employment rate, those numbers are much higher for LGBTQ people as a whole. And so entrepreneurship is such a wonderful pathway to kind of work around. If you're having challenges trying to get a job working for someone else, if you have a skill, you have that fire in your belly to start a business, this could be another pathway of building wealth for yourself and for your communities. And really what the NGLCC tries to do is to lift up the reason why certification is really valuable for LGBTQ people, and to also share with larger businesses and corporations the value of bringing in the perspectives and voices of LGBTQ business leaders. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be around training around being a more LGBTQ inclusive organization to hire an LGBTQ firm. You could hire someone who's a communications expert to help with your website and kind of add, hey, you might want to add some pictures, or give an opportunity for your C-suite to include their pronouns to showcase that you're thinking about LGBTQ inclusion. And so it's being able to see things that would otherwise be invisible by welcoming in LGBTQ business leaders. So I think the work that NGLCC is doing is really powerful in helping businesses, helping larger corporations honor their commitments to social responsibility, and specifically serving LGBTQ communities in a powerful way. So thanks for that opportunity to share a little bit about it. If folks have more questions on that certification, I'm happy to answer them in the chat or offline.
Great. That is great. And we did add the Out Entrepreneur podcast information in the chat as well. So, Lauren.
Yeah, so I am going to share some questions from the stage. So this one's from Lenroy. He says, Rhodes, can you talk about the work on the college and university campuses that are helping the students, faculty, staff, and administrators address this topic? And I'm guessing that this topic is probably belonging, if Lenroy could clarify.
Yeah, I can. I mean, there's colleges that are focusing in on bringing in speakers like myself to kind of introduce the topic of belonging. Higher ed has and continues to do a significant amount of work around DEI more broadly. So in terms of building all of the above. Okay, thanks. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's trending right now, actually, in higher ed that I think is interesting, and it's building off of advancing commitments and setting them, and trying to, trying to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments, is this idea of incident bias reporting. And it's not necessarily, it sounds like something that would come out of HR, but rather it's trying to keep fingers on the pulse of what's happening on campus. It's a relatively new idea that I think some corporate partners are trying to think through, okay, how could we do something similar to this in our own settings? And that is trying to kind of engage ERG groups to provide cultural response feedback around trends that are happening, but not really wanting to report to HR to start an investigation, but rather to give real-time feedback of communities that are having a hard time in the workplace. So the incident bias reporting is something that I've seen happening in higher ed around kind of this bigger piece of belonging. I think it's more about kind of at this point introducing the topic and trying to infuse that into the broader DEI work that's happening. That's as much as I know, so I'm not gonna get out of my lane and speak to that experience any more than what I can provide there.
Absolutely, it's very helpful. So the next question is from Catherine. She said, I lead in an unofficial ERG, which is Employee Resource Group, for Women in Energy. There is one cisgendered person who told me I should change the name to be more inclusive for trans/non-binary people to feel more welcome, with a very specific example from another city's bike club. However, many of our members feel like including them and accepting them within our group without a name change is more inclusive because we aren't calling them out as other. I am not sure what the correct thing is. Any feedback?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think for women in ERG groups, they may kind of focus on women or gender, but I think for women ERG groups, making sure that transgender women are included, and non-binary people, if they want to join the group, are also included. And I think that's a conversation that's important to have from organization to organization, because part of it is the education process and understanding trans women are women, transgender women, cisgender women, talking about challenges around sexism in the workplace. That's a kind of a shared piece, and it's a big challenge, right? And I think that there could be some good learning there. But I think it starts by engaging in that conversation with your group. And pointing to examples and determining what's possible within the culture. I think if a name change were to happen without that education piece, there could be some resistance and some misunderstanding. So I think that's really important. Some of the other trends that I'm seeing in organizations with LGBTQ groups is trying to have a focus area around gender inclusion for transgender and non-binary people, and having space for these larger groups. And so sometimes there's a subgroup. Some organizations have built separate ERGs for transgender and non-binary people, but there's space to kind of work with LGBTQ groups. I think the bigger piece is when we think about ERGs is more of the intersectional work that takes place between different groups. A couple of examples of what I mean is, during October, it's LGBTQ History Month, it's Latinx Heritage Month, and so kind of talking about the intersections of issues specific to LGBTQ, Latinx people. There's plenty of other examples that we could look at. Transgender Awareness Month is now a thing in November. It's built off of Transgender Day of Remembrance, and during that time, I've seen some ERGs with Native American ERGs, which is also Native American Heritage Month, talking about two-spirit communities. So those are examples of where you could start doing some of that education before kind of making these formal name changes. But again, I think that's an internal conversation. Education is really key. And if you feel stuck, the good news is that there's a number of experts out in the world that can kind of help advise. to speak specifically to kind of what's trending in your organization.
Yeah. And Rose, I want to get your opinion on this. And obviously you don't know every transgender person out there, but there's a perception that a lot of transgender individuals choose to go the entrepreneurial route because workplaces as they are right now just simply aren't safe, and they're not educated enough to support psychological safety for transgender individuals. So I'm thinking about like transgender individuals that are in high school and college, and they think about what they want to be when they grow up. And there might be limitations because they think I can't be safe in this environment. What can we do to proactively create safer work environments for transgender individuals so there's no limits and no ceilings of what they can do?
Yes. I think that's the call to action, I would say, for everyone on this call, and simply to look at the statistics. So the Harvard Business Review featured a story, and I'll share this with you all that you can share with your community. And they found that 25% of Generation Z Zoomers will identify as a gender different than their sex assigned at birth at some point in their life. Mm-hmm. That's in the United States alone. There's 88 million Zoomers, right? So 25% of that, someone can do the math there. That's a lot of young people that are already, some of whom are already entering the workforce right now. Our organizations weren't necessarily built to be gender inclusive. So when I was talking about inheriting workplace culture, we inherited the organizations we work in. That doesn't necessarily mean that the culture is fixed and it's never going to change. I think right now it would behoove us to start looking at how do we build more gender inclusive workplaces? And it's not as complicated as that might sound. And again, there's folks out there. This is one area of work that I do in my own company to help businesses with that. But I think that's a huge piece because, as I said earlier, some people have the fire in their belly to start their own businesses. Mm-hmm. Anybody who runs their own business knows that it's very challenging and it's not for everyone. And for trans and non-binary people, as you said, Lauren, the sky should be the limit. If you want to work for a big corporation and you have some skills and some, a perspective that's really valuable, ideally in our world, that could be an opportunity. It shouldn't be limited, and trans people shouldn't be expected to start their own businesses, or for many trans folks, engaging in survival economies because it's difficult to start a business, right? So there's some significant challenges, and I think for business communities that have that responsibility to corporate social responsibility, trying to give back to communities, trying to make a difference, this could be a huge area. And again, I think that the folks who are on this call, you're the right people. You're here because you're learning, and there's some good resources that are out there and available. So if there are questions on that, that's something I can definitely help out with.
Yes, we would love that resource we could share later with the group. That'd be awesome. So we have a question from Natasha, and it says, I'm curious about your take on including the plus in the LGBTQ community. Do you feel it is inclusive of other identities?
I think that adding more acronyms is great. I think that part of it, if it makes, there's a strength in numbers, and I think it's very important to name the groups that are included under the rainbow umbrella. And as a member of the T, there was a time that many organizations were just LNG, LGB. So I understand the pain of not feeling included in a community that you very much are a part of. The acronym continues to shift. I think for allies where it's like, oh my goodness, there's another letter. What am I supposed to do? Just stay open. In the work of doing DEI, even the acronym of DEI, we see idea, there's not consensus around DEI, right? So I think just be open to change. And that's kind of modeling that we are constantly learning on this journey of being inclusive, of building equitable organizations. And I think that's part of my role in doing LGBTQ plus work, is that, we have to model it as well. So for folks that might be wondering about the plus versus additional letters, the acronym can go to be LGBTQIAA+. There's more acronym or more letters there. And again, get curious, keep learning, and it's okay if you don't know everything about the LGBTQ plus community. Just continue to bring education into your workplace to understand how your organization can make a difference for your employees who are LGBTQ plus.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, Rose. And what comes to mind for me is that I think that part of the education is also helping people to realize that we're talking about some different issues under this broad rainbow umbrella. You know, one is gender identity, and then the other is sexual orientation and preference. And so it's so important for people to make sure they aren't just, even though we talk about it as one umbrella, that they aren't just lumping all of the situations that need to be carefully navigated to show support for this broad community. It's not a one size fits all, because there are different circumstances that we're talking about. So did you want to elaborate on that just for a second?
Yeah. And there's definitely, there's interconnection too, yes. Right? So if we're talking about sexual orientation, you know, as that may show up in the workplace, we're talking about partnership benefits, looking at, you know, any kind of policy that you have in building families, you know, making sure that that's inclusive of couples who are same-sex couples, right? When we're talking about gender identity as it relates to the workplace, you know, making sure, one, if you have trans employees who are going through a gender transition, that you've done the work in HR, that there's people knowledgeable about how to manage this, where the employee is centered, where their experience, where what feels right for them in the moment of disclosing this information, that things are set up. But that goes beyond, you know, to be inclusive of all genders really, are some simple things, right? When we do meeting introductions, we ask our names, and if people feel that they want to share their pronouns, giving people the space to do that. I often get questions from leaders around, do we ask everyone to share their pronouns as kind of a mandate? And I say, for anyone running the meeting, if you feel comfortable sharing your own pronouns, modeling that makes a really, really big difference, and encouraging people at the table to share, you know, their name and something that's important to them, you know, and to kind of leave that open. And sometimes, you know, when you model in a business meeting, you introduce yourself, you say a few things, you start to notice other people start to do that as well. Yes. So, you know, really modeling inclusion in that way, not a big ask, you know, to kind of share your own pronouns. And it really does make a world of difference for trans or non-binary people that might be at the table. Even if they don't feel comfortable at that point sharing their own pronouns, they remember you're someone who did, and you may be seen as someone where, you know, that's starting to build that sense of psychological safety, where that particular employee can start to trust you and take a few more risks, and kind of building that kind of strong team cohesion that you're looking for.
Absolutely. And it's such a simple thing. I think that's what always I gravitate to. We're not talking about, and certainly it can be complex, but there's also some really simple, practical things we can just implement into our everyday interactions with people. So I appreciate that. We're getting close to the top of the hour, but I do want to spend a second to talk about your book, Belonging at Work, Everyday Actions You Can Take to Build Inclusive Organizations. What's maybe 1 to 2 key takeaways that if someone were to get your book and really engage with it, that they could walk away with?
Yeah. So the book, really, it's designed, you know, in 3 different parts. And the first part is to kind of understand emotionally why we are wired for this sense of belonging, why it's important to work, what happens when we don't have it, and how that makes us feel like we don't have a sense of purpose in the work that we do every day. The second part is to kind of make the case for business leaders to kind of prioritize this. So if people need that kind of more intellectual understanding of what do the studies say, there's a good amount of information there. The last part of the book, and this is to answer your question, is really what are the everyday actions that we can take to make a difference no matter our role. And so for folks that read through that, that section offers, you know, encouraging self-education, encouraging considering your own role. If you're not in doing DEI work, what can you do differently to look at your work through a DEI lens to make sure that you're engaging in more equitable practices? Another really big piece that might be helpful, and this pops up in the work a lot, is how do we talk about this to people who may not be champions, but how do we bring other folks along about why this work matters and how they can see themselves in it? And what do we do when we encounter those folks that are somewhat resistant to doing this work? So really being able to speak to some of the concerns that arise, allay them, and keep moving forward by advancing your goals. So those are a few kind of simple actions that it's developmental. So it goes further. If you're like, I got that, I'm ready. There's definitely some additional things that are a little more challenging, but it was a lot of fun to write. And I hope that if people are getting this concept, they feel connected to it, but they're not quite sure how to implement it, just read the third part of the book. And I think you'll get some good ideas there.
That's great. Yes, and we will make sure that the book information is included into the follow-up for those of you who have joined this conversation. We're at the top of the hour, but I'm going to see if I can squeeze this last question in from Elizabeth Derby, because it's a really, really good one. What guidance do you give to companies who may have transgender staff going to client sites? You don't want to out the employee, but they may not feel safe to self-advocate for their needs at the client site.
Yeah, so I think with that, I think and this is probably, if there's not limitations around staffing, if you could send out staff with, a partner and someone who's very knowledgeable and supportive of that trans staff person initially, that might be a good starting point. Making accommodations is important. That's where I would start. I think that it would open up some additional. I know we're at the end of the hour. Elizabeth, if you have other questions on that, I have some other ideas as well. So I want to be respectful of time.
No, that is great. I'm so glad you were able to at least touch on. I think that the pairing idea is wonderful. But when I saw the question, I had to try to squeeze it in because I thought it was really, really good. Thank you so much, Rhodes. We feel seen, valued, and heard just by being able to share space with you and have you share with our community. And to all of you who joined today, again, we don't take it lightly. You could have been anywhere doing anything this Friday. And but we're just glad that you saw fit to join this community. We look forward to seeing you next week. Be sure to be on the lookout for a follow-up email from us today where you will receive a link to the replay. If it resonated with you, then don't just keep it to yourself, share it with someone else in your network. And we're just grateful to be in partnership with you around this very important work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Have a great weekend. Thank you again, Rhodes. We appreciate you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye.